Taking the tones that you've carefully crafted at home onto the stage or even just to the rehearsal room can throw up some unexpected problems. Certain frequencies can sound quite different, time-based effects can suddenly sound much washier in a bigger room, and it can even be just difficult to find out whether you're playing at the right volume or not. We all want to get these things right and have a guitar tone that feels good and inspires us, so we can concentrate on actually playing the gig and giving a good performance. So here are some of the things that I do to deal with the issues that come up with live sound, and hopefully they might give you some ideas on how you might want to improve your live sound too. Probably the most obvious place to start is just in the planning and preparation. Even though the sound does change a lot when you get to stage or rehearsal volumes, at least have a rough plan. So I like to practice at home at a loud bedroom volume, and to a backing track or rehearsal recording, whatever you've got, and get the settings on your amp and pedals just as close as you can to where you think they should be. And yeah, they may all change at Soundcheck, but it's kind of like the old saying, plans are worthless. The actual sticking to the plan is unimportant, but the act of planning is essential. So the next thing is making the most from a sound check. Ideally, I like to sound check with a song that has open sections, meaning that the structure isn't strictly set. So normally an open intro where the whole band can jam around an open intro riff, something like that, and we've all got time to make those small adjustments to our sound and move around the stage a little bit so that we can, spend the time getting comfortable and not have to worry about, hitting the next change in the song too much. Only when everyone's happy do you kind of give everyone the nod and the band leader can count you into the rest of the song. The bottom line is that you can't really make any meaningful adjustments to your sound if you can't hear it in context and you haven't got time to actually make those adjustments on stage to your settings. So, take the time to switch between different pickup positions and try your clean and dirty sounds or your rhythm and lead sounds. If you've prepared well, they should only really need some fine tuning anyway. The next thing that really helps is to have a very clear idea of the actual sound that you're listening for when you're doing a sound check and how to make the adjustments on your amp and pedals as quickly as possible so that, everyone can get on with the job. You don't want to be the one holding everyone up but making pedantic adjustments to your amp, have a clear idea of the sound you're after and how to get there quickly. And probably the most important adjustment to start with is stage volume. There's various ways you can measure how your guitar volume is sitting in the mix, but one I like to use is how your guitar volume sits in the mix and compares to the volume of the acoustic snare drum on stage. So particularly for rhythm and riff playing, I find the guitar shouldn't sound weak and quiet compared to the sound of the snare drum. At the same time, the guitar shouldn't be blaring and be so overpowering that it takes away from the satisfying crack and attack of the snare drum either. It's just a sound I'm quite familiar with, that balance between those two instruments, so I like to focus on that. They're both, high mid-range instruments. They should be working together. You can try this method to set your volume or one of your own, but the main thing is that you know the sound you're after and you know how to get to it quickly. No messing about and holding things up. Another thing to think about is your amp placement on stage. Guitar speakers are pretty directional, especially in the high frequencies. A lot of people call it the beam of treble that comes from the center of a speaker cone on a guitar amp. Whether you decide to use tilt back legs, an amp stand, a vertical 2x12 instead of a horizontal 2x12, just move around the stage a bit, know what's going on and adjust as needed. It's always going to be a bit of a balancing act. I find myself setting up quite close to my amp these days, and if I tilt it up, I get a beam of treble right in my ear and I have to turn the treble down, and then it's too dark everywhere else on stage and in the audience. So that tends not to work for me too much. Amp stands I'm quite a fan of, or just sit your amp on a chair. That way it's kind of closer to your head, but it's not pointing directly at it most of the time. It's another reason why I like the vertical 2x12 setups as well. But bottom line is you just move around as much as you can, move around the stage, into the audience space if you can, and get the best balance possible for both you and the audience. After you've got a comfortable overall volume, the next thing I would look at is EQ. I'll try and keep this as simple as I can. With bass frequencies, I just listen for a strong, full bass response without it sounding so, powerful and deep that it gets in the way of the bass guitar or the kick drum. I'm listening for that kind of crossover between those instruments so that they all can be heard. With treble frequencies, I find, I'm listening for a clear, bright sound, but not one that is, fatiguing or harsh. It shouldn't make you wince, that high end. With mid frequencies, you can increase those to be heard over the rest of the band, and they kind of help you poke out in the mix without having to turn up your overall volume. Or if that's not an issue, you can reduce the mids for a slightly smoother, rounder sound. If you want more control over EQ, then EQ pedals are great, from basic 3-band to graphic and parametric EQ pedals. For time-based effects, and particularly reverb, I find I often completely turn off the more subtle, always-on room type reverbs that I might use when I'm practicing at home in a small room. Because think about it, you're probably doing the gig in a fairly big room anyway, and those subtle always-on reverbs can just make you sound a bit too washy, and it's easy to get lost in the mix that way. But the more featured big delays and reverbs that I use, I often find myself turning up the level on those so that they can be heard as a feature effect and that they can be heard above the natural sound of the room. But it depends on the venue, depends on the gig, and another thing to think about is, is the venue empty when you're doing the sound check? Because if that's the case, it'll be quite lively when you're doing that sound check. And then when it's full, all those bodies absorb a good amount of the sound. So you've got to be ready to compensate for that difference. Noise gates are worth mentioning. If you play music with a lot of high gain, then you might use one already, but even if you don't, it's useful to have a noise gate pedal or something in your bag just in case, for those venues where there might be weird wiring and you might get a lot of noise from stage lights. That often happens especially if you've got single coil pickups and stuff like that. You can sometimes get away with that if you just move your guitar and find the right angle where it doesn't buzz anymore. But for really sticky situations, it's handy to have that noise gate pedal. You can just patch it in after your gain stages and before any time-based effects, and it really helps control things. It's worth mentioning earplugs too. You can go all out and get the expensive custom molds. A lot of my friends have those and they really like them, but they are expensive, and I have a horrible habit of losing my earplugs a lot. So I tend to go for the more standard Alpine music safe earplugs, and I think the latest version of them are actually pretty good. I use them a little bit at sound check, normally just one in on the side of the drummer sometimes, but I want to hear the natural sound of the room as much as I can in that situation. And then at the gig, it's a little different. I'll have one in and then one half in, half out. And when I'm satisfied and comfortable with the overall sound, that's the time where I'll put the other earplug in, and then I'm kind of fully protected for the rest of the gig. If I hear anything weird going on, then I can just take one half out and see what's going on and make any adjustments that I might need to, and then put it back in. But that's what works for me. And I had a hearing test not long ago, and my hearing's actually surprisingly good considering my age and how long I spend in loud music environments and stuff like that. So find something that works for you and just keeps your hearing intact. Otherwise you can't make those adjustments and things if you haven't got a decent set of ears. That's just what works for me. Share anything I might have missed down in the comments. They're actually a really good source of information as well. I haven't talked anything about monitoring systems or working with sound technicians and stuff like that. I'll maybe do another video on that if you want me to. But if you found some of this stuff kind of useful in this video, then make a note of it and try it at your next sound check. Hopefully there's something there you can find useful, and have a good gig.